Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everybody on this webinar. Welcome. Today we're going to, well, I say Ellen's going to walk you through why you should be developing some corporate Viz standards. Ellen, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect. Over to you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, yeah, like Lorna said, today, I'm looking at how and why you develop corporate Viz standards, given which I'm going to start off with the why. Although a little bit before that, I probably should give myself a little bit of an introduction. So, like Lorna said, my name is Ellen. I'm a core team consultant at the Information Lab. I think I've been there for 3 years now. But prior to that, I went through the data school, which is where we sort of train our next generation of analysts, and during which we do sort of 4 6-month placements at various different companies. And whilst I went through this, the reason I bring it up is that quite sort of early on, I had more of an affinity for Tableau, and I quite enjoyed the design stuff, and I was all right at it. So I kind of immediately got earmarked into placements where I'll be doing a lot of dashboarding, where either I'd be using templates that had already been generated, or in a few instances, I was lucky enough to start sort of creating my own corporate Viz standards and implementing them. And so, yeah, I've got a little bit of experience in this area, which is why I'm doing this webinar for you guys today. So like I kind of jumped the gun earlier, to start off with, I'm going to be looking at why you should develop your corporate Viz standards. And there's 4 main points I'd like to cover. And these center around design, trust and confidence, best practice, and lessening the workload. So what I'm flashing up on the screen at the moment are just a few examples of some dashboards that I've built recently. These are sort of external ones that I kind of built in conjunction with Tableau, or using the Information Lab branding just to make a few demonstrations for a few industry examples, and they're just something to have on the screen whilst I ramble on for a little bit. But when I'm talking about design, I'm always sort of operating under the assumption that the standards that we're applying and that we're creating aren't going to impinge on the quality of the analytics we've already built. So it's not about taking a dashboard that uses the sort of default settings and making it look pretty and sort of going for a style over substance kind of thing. It's about making things increasingly accessible and not detracting from that. But in saying that, one of the sort of primary and most obvious benefits of creating corporate standards is ensuring a certain level of pleasant aesthetics across your content. And whilst the quality of our analytics should always be our primary concern, I've found that it's pretty undeniable that you find people more willing to engage with your work, and you're more likely to pique interest when things are at a certain level of visual quality. I found this was particularly sort of prominent in placements where Tableau was in its infancy. I joined a few placements where there was a few creator licenses, Tableau was doing its whole sort of land and expand. And I found when I was able to go in, sort of create my own dashboard templates, and they had this certain level of consistency, and they had a design that evoked the sort of company brand, and they looked a certain way, that they were much sort of more additionally effective in turning heads and gaining traction, and were really beneficial in kind of getting the name of Tableau out there amongst these organizations. So the next thing I'm going to touch on is trust and confidence. And despite my first point, it is important to add that Viz standards are more than taking a Tableau dashboard and making it look pretty. It's also about inspiring confidence, and I feel corporate Viz standards have the ability to do that. As we know, oftentimes when you work in data visualization, particularly in companies that are used to doing things a certain way, so say that they're used to sort of making decisions based on experience and intuition, or perhaps they're struggling to move past looking at raw data, just looking at things on a row level, or they just want to see everything in a table. We've all kind of been to a client where we're trying to make sort of bar charts and line charts, and they just kind of want to stay in a sort of the comfortable sphere of looking at tables and data in a particular way. When we're coming up to them with sort of Tableau dashboards and sort of visual analytics, there can sometimes be like an element of sort of skepticism or dubiousness in regards to the visualization that we show them and the things that we create. They're kind of like, where's the data coming from? What exactly am I seeing? And whilst, there are kind of good, relevant questions, I feel that having Viz standards can help sort of ebb away at some of these sort of some of the sort of suspicion that can be had around, you know, our sort of jazzy dashboards with bars and lines and things that may not be sort of visualized in a way that they're used to. And when you have an established corporate branding, it helps add, you know, a certain weight to your content. It kind of acts like a stamp of approval. You're making something familiar. It has the appearance of that it's approved content, and it inspires confidence by illustrating to the user that it is approved content and it's analytics that they can trust. Next 2 points are going to look at our best practice and lessening the workload. So when we talk about best practice and when we're establishing our Viz standards, and this is particularly the case when you're, you know, not only creating your dashboard templates, but when you're creating the concurrent documentation that should go alongside it, this gives you the ability to sort of start ensuring those good behaviors early on. And in my case, sort of getting rid of some of those pet peeves that you kind of come across when you see other dashboards that people are creating. So for example, in terms of best practice, this may surround sort of when we should and shouldn't use diverging color schemes, and how we should use color or text and icons to make our analysis more easy to understand and sort of as digestible as possible. And sort of a brief note on this, relating more specifically to accessibility. This is a topic that we've been talking quite a lot about at InfoLab at the moment, with some sort of talks internally and having guest speakers. They sort of put forward the notion that it's often thought that ensuring accessibility and ensuring ease of use for certain users will sort of benefit that group alone, which, whilst is sort of a worthy cause in and of itself, having these sort of thoughts around accessibility for others often has the impact of making things more accessible for everyone. An example that we're very used to and is kind of focused on a lot is color blindness. You know, we all know that we shouldn't use a red and green color scheme, but occasionally those stakeholders are very adamant that they want to go forward with this. And in your sort of Viz standards, you can include a sort of colorblind friendly red-green color scheme, you know, in which you'd use a really cool toned green and a really warm toned red. Or if we're thinking one that's sort of less commonly thought about, if we think about dyslexia and legibility in general, you can always state within your Viz standards that we should avoid going below a certain font size, avoid large portions of text in capital case, and ensure a sufficient contrast between our dashboard background and our text, whilst avoiding a sort of black text on a stark white background. You know, this can often cause glare and find things that are sort of a little harder for a lot of people to read, and maybe think about using off-whites, pastels, and a lighter sort of font choice. And there isn't really a better time to have these conversations about accessibility than sort of right at the start of your journey when you start creating these Viz standards. And finally, my last point before we move on to a few other things about sort of how we create our standards is lessening the workload. So I've briefly sort of touched on this on the user side of things already. We want our users sort of to have a little thinking time as possible when they're sort of understanding the content that we create. There's also clear benefits for creators when we're sort of thinking about how we go about creating these standards. So I know that whenever I make a Viz myself, I always force myself to leave all formatting at the end. Otherwise, I know that I'll like sink an enormous amount of time cycling between color schemes and styles of going about things. And when you establish standards like this and sort of roll them out amongst your organization, it removes an awful lot of this potential decision making for your creators and gets rid of all of this back and forth. And in turn, it expedites the sort of dashboarding process and reduces development time. And also some people just, you know, really don't enjoy formatting. They don't enjoy design. They don't want to be thinking about sort of what color goes with what. And creating these standards helps give them a really good head start. And I haven't had too much experience with this in the past personally, but it's definitely something I've heard some of my colleagues sort of discuss and have a bit of a gripe with in the past is sometimes when you're speaking to a stakeholder, they can get sort of stuck on the more peripheral details. And in turn, this can sort of hamper your discussions that you have about the dashboard itself. So for example, you know, you might be asking, does this dashboard tell you everything you need to know? Am I answering your business questions? You know, is it showing you all the relevant information? And a user will be getting hung up and being like, oh, you know, I really don't rate the shade of blue that you've used. And you're like, okay, well, that's good. I can change that in the next iteration. But, you know, what are the charts saying? And then, you know, then they start moving on to how they don't like the orange either. And this can sort of get in the way of conversation sometimes, and introducing that pre-agreed upon standard can really help circumvent these kinds of issues. So that was kind of the why covered there. Now we're going to start talking about how you should develop your corporate Viz standards. And there's two things I'm going to touch on here are usability and repeatability. Additionally, sort of when I'm talking about developing corporate Viz standards, a lot of this is sort of focused on those more initial stages, thinking about how you would create your template, thinking about how that template may work with when your creators are using them, thinking about how you create a corporate color scheme, and sort of less so on the rollout side, but I will include like a few things on that, good examples of how people have rolled out these templates. So the first thing I would like to touch on is ease of use, which is a pretty crucial thing when you're thinking about creating a corporate Viz template. And the first thing I'd like to mention is the settings pane, or whether you call this a filter pane, essentially where your sort of logos and filters and color legends and so on sit. I always put these on the left, or I'd recommend either putting them on the left or the horizontal. Quite often it crops up kind of left or right debates, or which side should you put them on the dashboard. And I always sort of die on the hill of them sitting on the left usually, or maybe horizontal, as for a few different reasons. If we think about sort of e-commerce and websites, the lion's share of these are all going to have their filter panes on the left. It's generally what users are used to. Particularly as well, this is sort of heightened if in cultures where reading goes from left to right. It kind of makes sense that the sort of user is drawn to the left and they move across the dashboard. And additionally, often when you look at tests to see where users' eyes go when they're looking at a screen for the first time, it starts in the top left and it focuses on the left and the center, and it often moves in like a Z configuration. So that's where it always makes sense to me to put things on the left. Additionally, I know that Tableau have brought in those kind of handy collapsible containers. I've used these recently with a few sort of external projects that I've been doing for my filters, and I'm not the hugest fan of them. If you haven't got many filters or color legends and stuff like that going along, then they're pretty handy. But in like a proper corporate business context, when it's likely that you'll have a lot of different color legends, like we have here, you'll have an awful lot of different filters. I kind of prefer to have it just them all readily available and be able to be seen on the side. The user doesn't have to open up a container and wonder what these individual colors mean. And also probably maybe just a personal preference, whenever I'm applying my filters to the dashboard I'm looking at, I quite like to see the changes sort of in front of me. And if I've got a big sort of almost opaque container covering up a lot of my dashboard with sort of filters and color legends, it's going to sort of remove that user function for me. So yeah, the many reasons we harping on there about why I like to put things on the left or horizontally across the dashboard. The second thing is thinking about colors and icons and making sure that you include these in your headers or in your settings pane. So you can see here that I've got a couple of color legends and so on included in my settings pane, but I also like to try and ensure, if it's like a simple chart, to include individual colors and encode things in the title itself. This means it's as close to the chart as possible. You're grouping together the relevant information and your user doesn't have to go searching to sort of wonder what these individual colors mean. And generally just kind of just doing descriptive titles and just making it easy for users to sort of navigate and understand exactly what they're looking at. Another really important one, and one that I always try and make sure I do, is ensuring that you make users aware of your interactivity. So I've highlighted my little click action here with a little triangle next to it. This was my first placement was at JLL, and they have a very sort of expansive style guide, and they actually had 3 of these. They had a click action, a hover action, and a URL action, but I never really found myself using the other 2, so I always just maintain a click action on the dashboards that I make. Kind of use that up to your discretion of kind of the different interactivity you'd like to encode in your sort of legend. But I always make sure that I put a little triangle next to things that are filterable, because you're often dealing with users, or you're working with users that have a wide range of sort of skill when it comes to interacting with dashboards, and it just takes people shouldn't have to go through and click on your charts and try and work out what's interactive and what's not. So I always like to do a little triangle and usually include a bit of text if I need to, saying, if you filter this, then it'll filter these charts by this particular dimension and so on. And yeah, just making it as obvious to the user as possible what's interactive and what that interactivity will do. Another really important point that I always like to include is an info button. particularly when this is always just a good place to put various bits of information. You can like include in there when the data was refreshed. You can include in there where the data comes from, which is really handy. It was a question that used to get quite a lot when you were rolling out dashboards to a large user group, is, you know, where exactly is this data coming from, what particular database and so on. So including things like that, or another good one. So I was recently with an insurer, and at an insurer, there's an awful lot of sort of ratios and calculations that are very specific to that particular industry. And, you know, even though I was working with these ratios all day, I would very often not look at it for a week, come back and have no idea what all of these ratios meant and what the acronym stood for. So an info button where you have like a long list of what all these particular calculations are and how exactly they're calculated, can help sort of answer a lot of the questions that the user has before they have to, you know, come to the developers and ask these questions. And finally, just a good use of white space dividers and padding. So in a lot of my work, again, pick this up from JLL, is keeping these dividers between particular charts and making sure that you're grouping relevant content. And in doing so, ensuring that you have a decent amount of padding and a lot of white space. These last 2 points are kind of what I meant by making sure you get rid of your pet peeves in your the Viz standards you're creating. I feel like you should have 10 padding on everything. So if I were making dashboard standards, I feel like I'd just put that in across the board. And also it's a thing that you kind of see brought up, like I brought up dyslexia earlier and how you make things more accessible to people with dyslexia. A point that they often include in their documentation, how to make things easier and more legible, is to make sure you're including a lot of white space between certain things, and you're grouping relevant content with borders or sort of lack of white space. So I always find that's a good thing to include, and something that I always try and include in my dashboards. And lastly, I'd like to mention is filter configuration. So I'm going to jump into Tableau actually and ignore that to look at this one. So this is the template that I've been referencing, and the one that I quickly mocked up for today's session, which incorporates the InfoLab branding. So in terms of in terms of sort of customization and configuring your filters and ensuring that these are consistent across all of your dashboards, because, you know, again, you're going to be working with a wide range of users, so it's nice for all the filters to be consistent in the way in which they work. I always like to do a multi-value drop down and ensure that I have the apply button selected. It's a real sort of personal hate of mine when you don't have the apply button. You know, you have to untick all and then all your data disappears and you have to bring it back in, and often users kind of get a bit scared and wonder if they broke something. So yeah, filter configuration is kind of another thing, and setting out a standard for that and how you sort of show your parameters and so on is another thing that I'd keep in mind when creating your templates. And going on from sort of what to include in sort of these regards, and the things that you should stipulate, I'm going to talk a little bit now about size and also configuring your containers correctly. So if I exit this quickly, you'll just able to see the size I've gone for this particular template. I've gone for a fixed size, and I've gone for the generic desktop size. I don't always stick to this size, but when I'm making templates, I usually do something between 13 and 1400 for my width, and for a height between 7 and 800. Personally, just on all my different placements, I've found that, yeah, almost people who have quite sort of established Viz standards generally always go for these kind of sizes, because they're what fit best to the sort of particular screen size that their users have. If you're aware of a sort of, you know, better size that more closer represents a screen size for a lot of people in your organization, and obviously lean towards that kind of height and dimension. But that's the kind of height and width I generally go for. I never go for the range or the automatic. I've had to try and use automatic sizing before with the sort of by the request of a few stakeholders, and there's just really difficult to make a dashboard kind of look nice in any way when you're using automatic sizing. You know, if you're using fixed containers of a fixed sort of height or width, then, you know, they don't expand along with the dashboard properly. And then if you use ones that aren't fixed, and you can't really predict how things will kind of get bigger and smaller, and lots of things end up sort of truncated and all over the place. So I always recommend using a fixed size when you're making your dashboard templates. Additionally, I've kind of gone for a landscape dashboard here. I always try and visualize my dashboards on something this size and something of this orientation. But there is a time where like long form dashboards can be handy. I try and avoid these generally because I don't like having to scroll through my work and, you know, have users only being able to look at certain bits of content at a time. I kind of like everything to be on the page at once. But if I were creating some sort of Viz standards, I would have a sort of landscape version that you'd encourage people to use for the sort of majority of the dashboards that they're creating. And then maybe include a long form version that had, say, the filter pane at the top rather than the side. And, you know, we're trying to sort of impart consistency, but that doesn't mean that, you know, sometimes you just can't make a dashboard. Needs too much information for it to fit on the sort of specific size. So there is some adaptability either way. You just have to make sure that obviously every dashboard in a workbook is the same size. But yeah, I do recommend having sort of multiple templates for people to use. So there's a little bit of leeway, but it's still keeping things relatively consistent. And that brings me on a little bit talking about containers. So I mean, even when I'm making sort of personal viz, and that's things that are more sort of Tableau public-y in a way, I almost usually exclusively used tiled containers, and particularly in a business context and making things a client, I never use floating containers personally. Several reasons for this. You know, if you're changing the size of your dashboard, if you're using floating containers, they don't really constrain, and the size doesn't change sort of concurrently with the dashboard size, and it makes it, you know, big old faff to sort of change sizes. Additionally, when you start uploading things to Tableau Server or Tableau Online, you'll oftentimes find that things and sheets that are floating will kind of not necessarily stay in the same place. And particularly when you use them in conjunction with tiled containers, things can get a little bit all over the place. And yeah, I find everything's just a lot quicker when you're using tiled containers. So when making your template, I recommend using tiled containers, and I recommend sort of making sure they're configured correctly. When you're first sort of getting to grips with Tableau, I think using containers can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And I think we've all sort of built quite complex dashboards where we start taking sheets in and taking sheets out, and we end up with sort of way more containers than you need. And sometimes you find things are just snapping together a bit bizarrely. So when making your template, I recommend sort of playing around and coming up with something that maybe looks a bit like this, or whatever you think is, you know, sort of most beneficial to the creators in your organization. And then once you've done that, sort of start again, build it from scratch, and make sure you have all your containers set up correctly. For this particular dashboard, my containers look like this. So I have my sort of large green one on the outside, and I've got two secondary containers, one for my settings pane and one for the sort of main body where all my sheets go. And then inside of that, I've got my sort of pink section for first one being for my title, second for the bands, and then my first set of sheets and my second set of sheets. And yeah, the reason I'm harping on quite a bit about containers is I know that one of my placements, there were some Viz standards and templates already built, but the containers were sort of configured quite bizarrely, and every time I downloaded it and sort of tried to move sheets around, things would behave in, yeah, a pretty nightmarish fashion. And I think it got to the point where I rebuilt it from scratch. It looks exactly the same, and then I may or may not have saved over the original, so it was no longer a nightmare to use. And obviously you don't want your creators to be doing the same things that I did, because I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, so making sure, if a lot of people are going to be using it, you know, you have to make sure you get the sort of fundamentals and the basics quite clear. So yeah, be wary of your containers. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is color. So I'm going to rant on a little bit about color. Color is quite a soft spot for me, and talking about sort of how many colors you need and how to go about them. And I've kind of got this little bit set up here, but I am going to show you a couple of examples in a minute. So when we're talking about colors and how many colors we need, I think you need kind of 5 minimum, and whether or not it's 5 or 4 kind of depends on how much of a pedant you want to be, and whether or not you count grey as a shade rather than a color. But yeah, I'm going to count it, and I think you need at least 5. And always use it sparingly. I'm going to show some examples of how to do that in a second. And also within using it sparingly, this is what I mean when you select your main color. So your main color should sort of cover the lion's share of your dashboard. It should be a light color. It should be something like a gray, a stone, a pastel, or a really low opacity version of its existing corporate color. So for example, say the main color of your corporation was teal, you could use like a really washed out pastel blue green, and that could be the color for your settings pane, it could be the color for your bars, and so on and so forth. And variations of this shade should be used throughout the dashboard. And following this, you kind of need your positive color and your negative color. So if we think about sales and like month-on-month analysis, what color do you want when things are going up, and what color do you want when things are going down? And then on top of that, you need at least one additional highlight color. I'd say at least 2 or 3, and these should not be able to be confused with your positive or negative colors. So if I show a few examples of these in action, this is just a demo dashboard I built for insurance. So for color here, my main color is clearly this gray that I've got going on, and that makes up my sort of settings pane that I have here. It also makes up the color of my sort of containers, also makes up the color of my bars when they're sort of not being highlighted, and just the sort of the main constituents of the dashboard. Following this, whenever something's good and it's positive and it's going up or down relative on the metric, that's highlighted in the sort of purplish shade. I've got orange for all my negative points, like I don't want this going up, and it's bad obviously when my gross written premium goes down. And then I've got this light blue here as my highlight shade for whenever to highlight the specific broker that you're looking at any given time. I didn't need to incorporate my second highlight color in this particular dashboard, but it would have been there if I needed it. And a sort of second example that I have of this is I've been building some banking dashboards recently with Tableau, just as sort of some industry examples. And I was, as you can probably guess, I was able to use my own color palette here, hence why everything is pastel. And again, my main body, the main body of the dashboard is gray, and that's for the dashboard itself, for all of my sort of containers and my bars throughout here. I've got my positive and my negative. And then this is a better example of the highlight colors. I've got one highlight color here for my targets, and I've got another highlight color here to represent whichever advisor is being selected at the time. I didn't want to use yellow for both because, I was worried that people kind of maybe confuse if these two were the same color. And I mentioned this kind of the 5-color rule, or at least that, because I've seen a few times when, consultants will go to a particular client and their color scheme is just their corporate sort of logo, or their color scheme is just say bright red, gray, and black. And when you have a color scheme that's so limited, and if you're sort of reusing the same 2 or 3 colors across all of your individual sheets, and they represent different things, and you're sort of conflating them, it's going to become quite confusing to the user. So yeah, even if red is the only color that you use that isn't gray, I recommend getting some other corporate colors in there just to make things more accessible and more easy for your users to understand. Moving on from this, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of brightness, saturation, and opacity, because it's another sort of pet hate of mine. I don't really have to ask whether or not column A or column B is easier to look at. I find column A pretty heinous. It's really hard to look at, particularly this green one is like practically moving off the slide for me. And they're really intense. And whilst colors like this are really great because they immediately draw your attention, it also means that they need to be used in a very limited fashion. And when they're taking up quite a lot of real estate like this, they can be pretty hard to look at. And the reason this is because they're so saturated, they really overstimulate the retina, and then that causes your eyes to strain. But if we do something as little as applying 8% sort of brightness and saturation, then you kind of find that you have something that's a lot more easy to digest. And this kind of begs the question of, what if my corporate colors are really, really bright? Like, what if your corporate colors are this kind of green and this kind of red? If that is the case, I recommend when developing your corporate color palette that you do some things to make it a little sort of more easily digestible to the user. And you can do that by either decreasing the brightness or decreasing saturation / increasing transparency. So in doing so, you'd make it less white or more gray. And I've got a little example here of maybe what that would look like in real terms. So say you're developing your corporate color palette, but your logo uses 2 really sort of bright colors like this, or more than 2. I'd kind of get around this and try and circumvent this by doing something a little bit more like this. So I've made the bars really transparent. I've kind of calmed those colors down a lot, and I've just highlighted the end with the sort of proper true sort of hue and shade to just draw attention. But I personally find it, much less sort of overwhelming to the eye looking at this sort of pastel version than this really bright one. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about repeatability. Now I've kind of gone on enough about colors. And what I mean about repeatability, this is kind of when we start thinking about the rollout and how people are going to use this in real terms. So let's pretend, after talking about our containers and our size and our corporate color scheme, that we've got all that developed. And now we're looking to sort of take that to the next level and make it more repeatable. This is how you kind of go about doing those early stages. So the first one is with color palettes and hex codes. So within Tableau, you have something within your PC and your documents, and in your Tableau repository, you have something called your preferences file. You can navigate to your preferences file, and you can select to open with Notepad. And once you do that, you get a view that looks a little bit like this. And you can see that I've got a little color palette highlighted here. You'll find sort of lots of articles online on how to do this in a little more detail. But this blue box represents sort of an entire color palette, and it's actually the color palette for Makeover Monday. So once you decide on your corporate color scheme, you just have to you can copy and paste, you can go into your preferences file, copy and paste something like this, and just replace these hex codes with the hex codes that you want to, the ones that are relevant to your corporation. And you can name it and select the type that it is, whether or not it's sequential, or whether or not it's regular, or whether or not it's diverging. You can then copy and paste this into your preferences file, click save, and then you have to sort of close Tableau and reopen it in order to get those color palettes to come through. But the implication of this is that then your users, they won't have to go to like a PDF or something and constantly use that little sort of the little highlight to get the colors and copy and paste the hex code. So they can just have them already in there within your workbook. And so that's one of the ways that you can sort of make formatting and your corporate Viz standards more repeatable for your creators. Okie dokie. And for this next one, we're going to think about how creators use our templates and take them forward. So for this one, I'm going to jump back into Tableau. And also just a little bit of a note on, say, how we think about hosting your dashboard template. If you have Tableau Server or Tableau Online, I would have all your templates and I'd upload these as workbooks onto your sort of Tableau Server instance. Or failing that, if you could keep them in a Google Drive or just somewhere that's sort of easily accessible where your users could download them at any given time. But if we think about how creators would use these kinds of templates, imagine, so I've got another workbook open. So imagine this is the work that your creator's been working on all day, and now it's time for them to sort of put it into a template and make things sort of look, more cohesive. What they would have to do is that they'd have to go down to this dashboard and they could click copy. Then they can navigate to the workbook that they're currently working on, and they can just paste that workbook in. It's going to get a little bit messy now whilst everything gets in. Give that a second. So, now I've got my sample dashboard in here, my template is in here, and we can see which sheets belong to my particular template because I've flagged them all with a sort of teal at the bottom, and I've also written template as the sort of prefix for all of my sheets in here. So I've got all my sheets highlighted in red, the ones that your creator wants to bring into the dashboard. And now it's really simple for them to sort of use this template and bring them in. So for example, say for this profit over time line chart that we have here, and say your user wants to swap that out for sheet 1, all they have to do is navigate over to the pane down here and click the swap sheets button, and then my sheet 1 is brought in for me there. And similarly, your user can do that for sheet 2, they can do that for sheet 3. I'm going to quickly cycle through these. It's a little bit, oh, I did the wrong one there, didn't I? It's a little bit repetitive. And they can go through, swap all their sheets out like so. And once they do this, you have to make sure that your user sort of deletes all of the sort of template sheets that you have in here, apart from your info button. So just delete all the template sheets. You don't need these anymore. You've got your dashboard and you've got all the relevant sheets that you wanted in there. Then once you've done that, your user will have to sort of navigate to a sheet that has this, because we're all based on Sample Superstore. Your user will then have to go into here, replace your sample store data source with the sort of main data source that your workbook is hinged onto. Click OK. And now this info button is sort of now associated with that, the main data source is associated with the workbook rather than Sample Superstore. And then you can close that Sample Superstore data source and then hide that final sheet. And then, obviously your user would then fill in their titles. They would put all the sort of filters down here, and that would be all of their sheets sort of put into that corporate standard. So it's quite easy. And once, you kind of get through the cycling of knowing that you need to unhide all your sheets, delete them, switch the data source over for your info button, and then close your data source, it is quite simple to sort of get that template in there and get all your sheets and making things look much more up to standard. And once you're doing your documentation as well, and obviously it's good to have documentation to tell users how to do this, particularly when they're just starting out with using these templates. I usually like to keep a little bit of a how-to into the info button, telling users how to use the template, and also letting the creator know that once they're done and once they've put all their sheets in, they should sort of delete what's in the info button and put in the relevant information that may help those users. Okay, so yeah, it's a little bit how creators kind of go forward using those templates once you've created them. And kind of the final point on repeatability, I appreciate sort of the stuff that I've talked about in terms of how you create your corporate viz standards have been much more focused on the sort of dashboard side of things, how you think about your sizes, how you think about your colors, how you use containers, and how the creators would use them in Tableau Desktop themselves. But I haven't touched too much on sort of documentation and the things that you create alongside your templates. That will be a little bit too much to cover in one webinar, but a really great place that you can look at to see how that's been rolled out in an organization where Tableau is really, really prevalent and it's used at a really high level is sort of the style guide made available by JLL, which you can find on the Tableau public. I know Lorna will sort of include the link to this at some point, but I can quickly open the link now, although I did have a bit of trouble opening this earlier. And yeah, this style guide from JLL is, this is what is sort of made available to their creators. I had this made available to me when I worked, I was placed there as an analyst, and it's an incredibly sort of expansive way of going through and saying why they've kind of done what they've done and how to use their templates and sort of, how to use colors and all the stuff like that, and sort of how to use containers and how to make the borders. So this is like a really good place if you're looking to sort of find out a little bit more about, you've made your template, you've thought about the colors, how your creator is going to use them. But if you're rolling it out and you've got an awful lot of creators and you're in a really big sort of organization where Tableau is really heavily utilized, then some materials like this, I believe the BBC has one as well, is a really good place if you're wanting to look at how to sort of make the concurrent documentation that goes along with the dashboard templates that I've discussed today. But yeah, that is everything that I had on today for the webinar in terms of the things that I would present. But we're happy to do a sort of Q&A section now. I can see a few questions popping up in the Q&A.
Thanks, Ellen. That was a really great webinar, so thank you very much for going through all of these. Yeah, it looks like there's a few questions in there. The first one was about struggling creating accessibility dashboards. Do you have any tips around creating accessible dashboards? I know we had an internal session on it a while back, but could you share anything?
Other than the ones that already mentioned, sort of a lot of them are to do with visual impairment. So, not going below certain font sizes, trying to avoid like really stark black on a really stark white background, because that can make things sort of move around a bit and make things a little bit harder to process. and avoiding capital case in sort of long bits of text, because a lack of rise and fall that you get from sort of, you know, capital that you get from title case makes things a lot sort of more difficult to read. But I think there are a lot of sort of resources out there sort of created by the groups themselves, which are kind of more informative, and there's also lots of guest speakers out there that are probably better at advising on those things than me.
Yeah, there's also a web extension that you can use called Funkify, that allows you to look at your Tableau dashboards and see what the visually impaired can see as well. So it helps you design for that. The other thing that was mentioned was the ease of use page that you had on. Was your colors working for colorblind people on that slide?
So for the information lab one, I generally, whenever I come up with colors, so for the green and purple or green and pink are ones I use quite a lot. There's a particular website that I can't remember what it's called, but if you Google, like, you know, color blindness photo or photo test, I always take a snip of the main colors I want to use, and then I put them, sort of upload them onto that, and then I go through all the different types of color blindness and go through. So generally, the colors I use are usually colorblind friendly, particularly for the ones where it's like, you know, the positive and negative colors. And blue and orange are definitely better alternatives to red and green.
Okay, perfect. There's another question that says, are there situations when you suggest to have informational text in a text pane instead of through an information button?
If it's really pertinent information, and I suppose it's the kind of thing that you get when you start showing dashboards to users. If there's a question where you kind of find yourself keep having to repeat it, you know, like, what exactly does this mean? What is this calculation? Like, what data are we showing here? Then that's the kind of stuff that I consider putting in that sort of filter section. There's definitely times where I think, yeah, it's required, and I suppose you'll see when you go through users, and if they keep asking the same questions about what stuff is, and it seems like it's more important than what should be in an info button, which is quite hidden away. That's kind of the rule of thumb that I'd use for that.
Cool. Ravi asks, would you recommend building a template workbook to share with end users, for example, other creators? I'm guessing yes, because that's what you've done.
Yeah, so the templates that I created, and for the placements where, you know, I would make them and then I created them myself rather than ones that I kind of had to use that were created by others. I would always sort of create a few templates, like a landscape and a long form, and then I would upload that to somewhere where, you know, pretty much everyone can see, on Tableau Online or Tableau server, where your creators have access to. And then, have all your creators be able to download that and work from that workbook.
Cool. Do you have any standards around device layouts?
Not particularly. I generally always, so you have that option in desktop where it just adds phone layouts automatically. I generally just delete those because I've never really had a sort of placement or a business requirement where a phone layout has been requested. And if you just leave your phone layout as default as what Tableau Desktop does for you, the results are always pretty shocking. So I generally always delete the phone layout, but no, I haven't actually had to build anything other than sort of general laptop screen. So I haven't got any advice for that.
Okay. To what extent do you recommend using brand guidelines or client requested specific typefaces or fonts?
How would I? Well, it kind of, because you have to make considerations, don't you, when you're using sort of Tableau Online and Tableau Server, and if you're using a custom font that doesn't render on those, and you have to sort of make sure that it's sort of installed on the server appropriately. And then if you're not using sort of server-side rendering, then you also have to make sure that font's sort of available on everyone's machines. And if that's a dashboard that doesn't just face internally, if that also faces to sort of external users and external machines, then you're going to find yourself sort of, those people, if it's, you know, not using server-side rendering, they're going to get some quite ugly typefaces coming through. So if it's like internal and, you know, it's something that everyone will have on their machines, as long as you have configured correctly on your server, then I think that's fine. But if it's something that's more external and it's sort of like a client facing, then I'd maybe be a bit wary of using it for those instances.
Cool. And then any chance you can remember the color, the website to check if the color is passed for colorblind?
No, I can find it, and then you can sort of add it to the YouTube video or send out afterwards.
Okay, Tally, I'll add it to the description of the YouTube when we upload it later this week, so check back then. Any other questions for Ellen just before we wrap up? Nothing else has come through. Nope. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Ellen. It's been great to have you and to talk about some Viz standards and some guidelines. They're definitely very important when you're creating those business dashboards, and like you said, for trust reasons, so that they all kind of look very similar or the same. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed this session. The YouTube recording will be available in the next couple of days, so do check that out. If you signed up via Meetup, you'll get a link to the recording sent to you as soon as possible. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.